Hello, once again, I welcome you to my YouTube channel. This video is a continuation of the previous two videos. In the first video, we learn how to create elastic Kubernetes cluster in AWS. If you want to check it out, you can check it out up there. In the second video, we learn how to create the compute capacity that will enable you to run your load on the cluster. You can also check that out. In this video, we are going to learn how to connect to your Kubernetes cluster from the terminal. Don't forget, you have created the Kubernetes cluster in AWS, and you have also created the compute capacity that will enable you to run the application on the cluster. Now, how do you access or how do you connect to this cluster? That is what we are going to be learning in this video. It's going to be a very short video, and we are going to jump right in it right away. I have created the cluster, and I call it demo EKS. Like I said, you can check out the video on how to create the cluster. And so if you go ahead and click on the cluster, I've also created the nodes. So I click on compute, and you'll see 3 nodes has been created, which is the compute capacity to run the loads. That is, if you're going to deploy your application or your website or your database, it is going to be running on these nodes, which I also call the compute capacity. So how do you connect to this cluster so that you can access this node? Now, we are going to be connecting using our terminal. You can use any of your terminal. You can use your command line, PowerShell, Ubuntu terminal. But today I'm going to be showing us how to connect using the WSL Ubuntu, which I'm very sure you might be familiar with. And then I will also show us how you can connect using your Cloud Shell. Now, what are the prerequisites? If you are using your terminal, if you are using your WSL terminal, like I will be using in this case, there are 2 requirements. First, you will need to install AWS CLI. The AWS CLI is the AWS command line that enable you to interact with the AWS console through your terminal. So you have to go to the AWS documentation, and you are going to install the CLI based on your operating system. For Linux, you can just click here. It's a very simple installation. Then you're going to copy the command, and you go ahead and install it. It depends on the flavor of your Linux. Either it's Linux 64 or ARM 64, as the case may be. So you want to go to this and copy the command and install it. I'm going to include the link right inside the video. After you must have installed the AWS CLI, you will also go ahead and install the kubectl, which some people call kubectl. So you need to also install kubectl on your terminal. The kubectl enable you to communicate with the cluster. So the AWS CLI will allow you to communicate with the AWS platform, because that is where your cluster is being created or is being hosted, while the kubectl or kubectl will allow you to communicate with the cluster. So this is also very straightforward. You're going to go to the Kubernetes documentation. I'm going to include the link below. So you go to go onto when you get into the documentation, then you go to click on install tool and setup, and you're going to check whatever you are using. If you are using Windows, you go for Windows. If you are using Mac OS, you go for Mac OS, and if you are using Linux, you can go for Linux. In this case, I've installed all that in my terminal. So I'm going to bring up my terminal. This is my terminal here. So this is my WS terminal. And in my own case, I have installed AWS CLI, and I've also installed my kubectl. So the next thing you want to do is you need to configure your AWS credentials. Let me quickly show you that. You can see in the Kubernetes cluster that I've created, if you look right up here at the top right, I have logged in with a username called Felix_admin. That is the username with which I logged and created my Kubernetes cluster. So I will need to get the CLI credential for this user. And how do you get that? You have to go to your AIM tab. I've opened that in another terminal. And you will go to the user. This is the user here. And the user is Felix admin. I will click on it. And if you click on security credential and you scroll down, you will see what we call access keys. So I already have one here which I have created. If you have not created one, here is going to be empty, and all you just need is to go to create access key. So you're going to create the access key, and it will create two items. It will create access key and secret access key. Then you're going to download it because you can only see it at once. So you're going to download it, and you're going to use it to configure your access to AWS platform. It is those credentials that will connect your terminal to the AWS cluster. So let me take you back to the terminal. So in that case, after you must have gotten your credential, you go onto your terminal and type the command AWS configure. If you type AWS configure, if you have not configured this before, it's going to ask you for your access key, which you have just created and downloaded. And when you supply that, I already have that. That's why you are seeing it on the screen. And you click enter, then it's going to also ask you for what? Secret access key, which you also have there. And you also provide that, and you click enter, then it's going to ask you for which region, your default region. You put it there. In my own case, it is US East 1. And it's asking me for how, if I put a GET request, in what format would the result be presented to me? So that is what you mean by default output. You can leave it as empty, but if you like, you can ask it to come as JSON. So that means your output will come in form of JSON file. So when this is done, then you are all set to connect to your AWS. So I'm going to clear the screen. So the next thing you want to do now is you need to communicate with your cluster. And how do you communicate with your cluster? You're going to communicate with your cluster by running a simple command. And that command is AWS EKS -region. Then you're going to state the region where your cluster is being created. And if you go back to my cluster is created in the, okay, let me go back to where my cluster is created. My cluster is created in the North Virginia, which is the US East 1. So I'm going to be providing US East 1. US East 1. That is my region. And after that, I will have update-kubeconfig. Now, this kubeconfig contains the credential that connects you to your Kubernetes cluster. It contains the credential and the keys that allow you to access your Kubernetes cluster. So update, kubeconfig, and then that's name, and then you put your cluster name. My cluster name in my own case is demo EKS. Let's confirm that. This is my cluster. I will go back to my cluster, and you can see this is the name here, demo EKS. So now this is the command, and I will press enter. And you can see it just says added new context, AWS, blah, blah, blah. And it told you where you can get. So it has created this kubeconfig file, which contains the credential. And now you are connected to the cluster. So now I'm going to clear the screen. And the first thing I want to do now is to check the nodes. So I will say kubectl get nodes. And you can see, remember, in our cluster, you go back to the cluster, you click on cluster, and you click on compute, you can see that we have what? 3 nodes that have been created. And the same nodes here, you can see them in the, if you look at the ID, if you look at the name, let's look at the last 3 numbers. You can see this one is 206, 25, and 125. So if you go back to those cluster, you will see 206, 25, and 156. So these are the nodes that are present in your cluster. You can also check the cluster. What is the cluster? And that is you have the command. Let me clear the screen here. You have AWS EKS list clusters. So you can see it has listed the cluster and it has given us in the name of the cluster that is present. Let me see if I can output it in JSON. Okay, that's that I didn't get. I don't think that is correct. So now that is the cluster that we have, because if you look at the name, that is the name of the cluster, demo EKS. Then you can check so many other things. You can check kubectl, kubectl get service. So this is the only service that has been created, and it's a cluster IP, it's a Kubernetes service. Just because we have not created anything here, the only thing we have now is our nodes, and we can see it. I can also check kubectl get, or let me say get pods. Let's see. I'm very sure we have not created any pods, so we are not likely to see any pods. So because no resources has been created, let's see if we have any namespace. kubectl get namespace. Okay, you can see we have this. These are the default namespace that are auto-generated when you created your cluster. But you can create your own namespace in it, and you can create your own resources. And now that you have your cluster ready, then you can now deploy your application or your website onto this cluster. Now, if you don't want to use your terminal, there's another way to connect to your cluster by using the AWS Cloud Shell. So I'm going to quickly show us that. So if you look at the top of your AWS console here, there's a little terminal icon here. So I'm going to open that in another tab. So it's going to open Cloud Shell. Now, Cloud Shell has been, you're not going to see all this if you're doing it for the first time. If you're doing it for the first time, Cloud Shell is directly connected to the current AWS resource that you are using. So if you are using Cloud Shell to connect to your terminal, you wouldn't need to install AWS CLI, and you also do not need to install kubectl. All you just need to do is to run the update kubeconfig command, and you'll be able to connect to your cluster. So I'm going to run that command again, and that command is AWS EKS. That's region, and the region is US East 1. US East 1, update kubeconfig. Then the name of the cluster, that's that name. Then the cluster is demo space EKS. And you click enter. And of course, you can see it just told you that it has updated the kubeconfig. Let me see if I can make it bold. Okay, no. I'm trying to see if I can make it bold. I'm unable to do it here. Okay, let me see. Large, maybe it will show. Okay, I think maybe you can see it here now. Let me do largest. Okay, so you can see now that this has been updated. And like I told you, you don't have to install AWS CLI, and you don't have to install kubectl. So if you just go ahead, if I clear the screen now, and I do kubectl get nodes, I should be able to connect to my EKS cluster. No, sorry, that's the wrong command. Get nodes. So you can see you have all the all your nodes, and they're all ready. You can get kubectl get namespace. You're going to see all the namespace that are available to you. You can also check service, kubectl check service. And you can see we have only one service, which is Kubernetes cluster service. So we have been able to connect, to successfully connect to our node from the terminal. And you'll be able to manage your cluster from your terminal very easily. This is what I plan to show us in this video. I hope you have learned something. Please, if this video is useful to you, kindly subscribe and like so that you can see videos anytime we upload one. Thank you for spending your time with me. I hope you enjoy it, and I will see you in the next video. Thank you. Bye-bye.